This is the point in the semester where we start talking about the Beck system in greater detail. And you've had a little bit of introduction to that last semester in 201, so hopefully you're aware of some of the basics, though it's kind of a complex system, so it takes a while to get used to. Before we go too in depth, I want to think a little bit about how we do forest classification in Wisconsin. And you might think that this seems pretty irrelevant, but what's helpful about it is the system that I learned when I was a forestry student is pretty similar to the Beck system in principle. The main difference is that the geography in Wisconsin is much simpler than in British Columbia, and so the classification system is also a little bit simpler. So I find it helpful to start thinking about a simpler system, and then we move on to the greater complexities in Beck. For a little context, there's Wisconsin. It's in the upper Midwest of the US, along some of the Great Lakes. Climate's similar to parts of Ontario. First off, let's think about what we can use to classify forests. So we might consider the trees. Are the trees important? Yes, they're kind of one of our main things of interest in a forest. Are they good for classification? Not necessarily, because the trees that are growing in a given location may be more representative of the successional stage at that location, rather than the characteristics of the site. Are they easy to measure? Yes, definitely. It's very easy to quickly identify and get some measurements about trees. Soil, very important. You know already that it has a strong influence on what types of vegetation can grow in a site. It's very good for classification because often differences in soil are what drives differences in vegetation. It's not as easy to measure though. To do good soil measurements, we have to dig a soil pit, get in there, do classification, so it's a little bit more involved than something like quickly identifying the trees. Climate. Climate's really important. As far as classification goes, it depends on what scale we're thinking about. If we're thinking about a continental or national scale, then climate can be really good for classification. But for classifying small differences in different forest types, there's other things other than climate that really drive those, so it doesn't work very well for that. Climate is potentially a little bit challenging to measure, but there are good networks and long-term data out there, so we can get access to that data over broad scales. And then lastly, plants. So we might not think plants are as important if we're thinking about classifying forests, thinking about the types of trees that might be there. But they are good for classification because plants help us to get insight into the soil. The types of plants that grow in a location are heavily dependent on the soil there. And plants are also pretty easy to measure. They're quick to identify, quick to take some rudimentary measurements. So let's go back to Wisconsin for a little bit of context. The topography is pretty mild. It's a little bit hillier in the southwestern part of the state, flatter in the rest of the state. Not a lot of variation in elevation, just a couple of 100 meters from Lake Michigan, which is the lowest point, to a hill in northern Wisconsin there at 595 meters elevation. Like British Columbia, glaciation was one of the abiotic drivers that has really resulted in the landscape we have today. And so the reason that southwestern part of the state is hillier is that area was never glaciated. And the retreating glaciers, in addition to reshaping the land, they also left significant deposits. So, like in British Columbia, much of the parent material for soils is from the result of glaciers. So let's think about climate. Since there isn't great variation in topography in Wisconsin, it's pretty much just latitude that drives temperature. So we have this gradual north to south gradation with cooler average temperatures in the north, warmer average temperatures in the south, but it's not a very big range overall. For precipitation, also have a north to south gradient, wetter in the southern part of the state, drier in the northern and especially northeastern part of the state. But again, not a dramatic range for annual precipitation. So soils are actually really what drives the differences in vegetation and forest type in Wisconsin. And a lot of this is related to the glaciation and the types of parent material that were deposited and how that parent material has evolved into soil over the past 10,000 years since the last glaciation. So when we think about soils, there's several things that soils provide for plants, but the main things that we think about are water and nutrients. Those are the main important things we think about as far as what type of soil and how that's going to influence the vegetation that grows in an area. Here's a slightly different version of the EDA Topic Grid that you've already seen. So we have our soil nutrient regime, ranging from very poor to very rich. The one difference based on the EDA Topic grids we use in British Columbia is this scale is flipped, so poor is on the bottom and rich is on the top. On the x-axis we have soil moisture regime, so again ranging from very dry to very wet. And this is important when we think about indicator plants. So here's a plant Myanthemum canadense, wild lily of the valley, or Canada mayflower. And this is a relative of false lily of the valley, Myanthemum dilatatum, which we have here in the Vancouver area. So this plant, if we look at its range of growth in a particular area in the state, we have the soil nutrient regime on the left, soil moisture regime on the bottom, and these represent different forest types, and the color is scaled to show the frequency. So when this system was developed in Wisconsin and people surveyed the vegetation at many different sites to figure out how to classify the different sites, in each of these forest types, they were able to calculate the frequency with which this plant appeared. So you can see for most of those forest types, this was there greater than 75% of the time, and even the ones where it was less present, it was still 25 to 50% of the time. So if you think about this in the context of an indicator plant, wild lily of the valley is not a very good indicator. When I learned this system, John Kotar, the man who developed the system, he said that wild lily of the valley is a good indicator that you're standing in a forest. It doesn't tell you much because it grows everywhere. So we say that it has a wide ecological amplitude. It is abundant everywhere, and therefore a very poor indicator species. It doesn't tell us much about what's going on in the forest. Okay, here's a relative of two of the alder species you know, Alnus rugosa, or speckled alder. So here we see it grows in a much more specialized area, so it doesn't grow in most of the forest types in Wisconsin, but it does tend to grow in these wetter, nutrient-poor sites. So in this case we say it has a narrow ecological amplitude. It's now just moderately frequent in those, so 25 to 50% or 50 to 75% of sites in those habitat types or forest types will have it present. But it's a pretty good indicator. Then we have a plant like blue cohosh, so that's a really good indicator of really rich sites. So you can see it has a narrow ecological amplitude, it's just growing in those very rich sites, and it has a very high frequency in those sites too. So that means if you're in a really rich site, there's a high likelihood that it will be there, so that makes it a really good indicator. Comptonia peregrina, or sweet fern, is a good indicator of poor sites. You see it has relatively high frequency in the very poor, dry sites, so it's a good indicator species. Lady fern, or Ethereum filix femina, which you should be familiar with, is also a decent indicator in Wisconsin. It grows in the relatively nutrient-rich sites, and it grows there with high frequency, so that also makes it a pretty good indicator. This table should look a little bit familiar. You've seen some tables similar to this for BC. So we have a chart of plant species. In this case, we're looking at shrubs. We have the scientific name in the first column, the common name, and then each of these columns represents a different forest type. In the Wisconsin system, we call them a habitat type, but they're often essentially plant associations. So don't worry about these abbreviations at the top for the moment. Just know that those are different types, and then we can see some information about the frequency and occurrence of these plants in these different habitat types. So in this case, the numbers represent the frequency of occurrence. So a dot means that it occurs in 10 to 25% of those sites. A 1 means 26 to 50%, and so on. So the higher the number, the more likely you are to find it present in that site. And then the letters relate to the coverage classes. So in addition to the likelihood that you'll find it, how much of the area should it cover? So is it going to be something that's going to be likely to be there but be relatively uncommon and rare? Or will it be something that's likely to be there and you're likely to find lots of it as well? So for example, the Corylus species, or hazels, aren't a great indicator species for this particular region, Region 1 in Wisconsin. And we'll get into what the regions mean, because it's pretty abundant in just about all of them, a little bit less abundant in these. Whereas something like New Jersey tea, Ceanothus americanus, is only frequently found in 2 of these types, so that's a bit better of an indicator. Similarly, we can look at forbs and subshrubs, so just grouping different types of plants. In this case, you see quite a few of these are good indicators for these 2 habitat types. And those abbreviations, we're going to get into naming plant associations later, but just know these abbreviations relate to the dominant tree species and the dominant understory species. So PQE stands for Pinus strobus Quercus rubra epigea. So the P for Pinus, Q for Quercus, E for epigea. And this notation here, you see the slash in there. The species listed before the slash are tree species. The species listed after the slash are shrub or herb species. And dashes indicate more than one species. So PQE, for example, means Pinus strobus, eastern white pine, and Quercus rubra, northern red oak, are the dominant tree species. and Epigea repens is the dominant understory species. And here we see the EDA Topic Grid showing where these different habitat types or these different forest types actually occur along that grid. So you can see they're representing a gradient in soil moisture and soil richness or soil nutrient regime. At this point, I hope you're wondering, but what about the trees? This is a forest classification system, but we've been completely ignoring trees up until this point. The reason that we ignore trees is, especially in Wisconsin, where sites can take multiple successional pathways, the trees that are present on a site are more reflective of the site history, whether it's harvesting history or natural disturbance history. That's going to play a much bigger role in determining which tree species are there than the underlying conditions. Whereas relatively soon after a disturbance, maybe 5 or 10 years, the plant community is able to reestablish itself and be representative of those soil characteristics. But this table for this region gives us some idea about which trees to expect in the different habitat types or forest types. So for example, in PQGCE, we have a lot of pines and oaks are the dominant trees. So again, the letters and numbers represent the frequency and the abundance found, and these different categories are saplings, medium trees, and large trees. So this gives us an idea about the tree species that we might expect to find in a given community. And we don't necessarily expect to find all of those tree species in a given forest type, because again, the species that are there are going to relate heavily to the succession and disturbance history. And here we see for this region the current relative importance of common forest cover types. Relative importance is a weighted measure of relative frequency and relative basal area, but it's basically telling us which of the trees are the dominant trees in a forest stand. So you can again see quite a range, and in contrast to a lot of the forests in BC, a lot of the forests in Wisconsin have much higher diversity, so a much greater number of species or types of species in a forest type. Okay, so let's do a classification. We're going to assume that we're in a site in Region 1. So we know where we are, we flip open our reference manual, we look at the map, and because there aren't sharp changes in climate or elevation like there are in British Columbia, the zones are conveniently drawn along county boundaries, so it's really easy to know where you are. So within that region, so in this case we're in Region 1, so we'll turn to the Region 1 key to habitat types in our guide, and it's just a regular dichotomous key that we're going to follow. So we'll read the key. So the first question, is the soil somewhat poorly drained, 2 or more species present? And those species that are present are wetland affiliated species. So it's kind of, are we in a real wet forest, or do we have soil that's moderately well drained to excessively well drained? And those species listed above are rarely present. And we're going to say in this situation we don't see any of those species. So we're going to go to key B. And again, we just continue following this dichotomous key. So the first question, 1 or more present vaccinium species, Gaultheria procumbens, Gallium boreala, and so on. So are we seeing 1 or more of those species? And the species on the right are rarely present? Or are we seeing 2 or more of these species on the right, or one of these being very well represented? And in this case, we're going to say that we found this. You haven't seen this exact species, but you should recognize that as a blueberry, a vaccinium species. And we see vacciniums, if we were just to look at the reference for that plant, tend to grow on poorer sites. So that's one species that we found. And if we look around, we see this plant, which is actually a relative of Salal. This is Gaultheria procumbens, or wintergreen. The leaves are much smaller, but it's a Gaultheria species. So again, this one tends to grow in poor to medium sites, but on a relatively dry soil moisture regime. Okay, so that's what we found. So we're going to follow, and we've said that the species on the right are rarely present. We didn't see any of those around. So we're going to follow the tree down. So now, 2 or more of these present, or species on the right rarely present. So we look around, we don't see any sugar maple, we don't see any violets, we don't see any trilliums. So we say species on the right rarely present. So we go down to the next question. And again, 2 or more of the following present. We look around, we don't see any of these species. So we say species on right rarely present. And then lastly, 2 or more present, Ceanothus americanus, Gaultheria procumbens, and so on. We've already seen Gaultheria procumbens. We saw that in our first step, that's wintergreen. And we also see some Ceanothus americanus, which isn't super frequent in the sites that it grows, but is still pretty specific in these poorer, drier sites. So that leads us to a final classification of PQG-CE. So we can flip to the EDA Topic Grid and see where that falls compared to other habitat types in this area. So we see it's the driest, poorest of the habitat types in Region 1. And if we want to see what that stands for, we can look it up and we see that the dominant tree species are Pinus strobus and Quercus or oaks, and the dominant understory species are Gaultheria procumbens, wintergreen, or Ceanothus americanus. So you can see the species that we have found are the characteristic species that this habitat type is named after. And then the helpful thing, we've talked in lecture about how one of the reasons to do classification is that if we have a classification and management objectives or management guidelines have already been drawn up for a certain class, once we know the classification of a certain area, we can just go look those things up and have a lot of information at our fingertips about the forest we're standing in. So in this case, we see that this habitat type tends to grow on or occur on deep, excessively drained, outwash sands. The moisture regime is dry, the nutrient regime is poor. We often have mixed stands or mixes of pine with red or pin oak, and a few other species potentially present. The neat thing here is the management implications. I won't read through this, but this gives us an idea about which types of tree species, if we're trying to grow timber, for example, which types of tree species might be good to plant here or good to manage for. The one thing I really like about the Wisconsin system that I think the Beck system falls a bit short on is thinking about disturbance and succession. In the Beck system, we kind of assume no disturbance after the initial disturbance, and then we assume that the forest stand goes from being dominated from species A to species B to species C over time, and then eventually it reaches its climax forest. Here, you see there's a much more complex successional picture painted in this diagram here. So it's not point A to point B to point C. We could have, for example, a jack pine, pin oak, red oak stand, and that might transition to pin oak or red oak, and that might transition to one of these later stages. Or we might start with an aspen stand, or we might have a pure jack pine stand. All of these forest types can exist in this PQGCE habitat type, and they can go different directions or different pathways based on management or disturbance. So that summarizes the Wisconsin system. It's similar in some ways to the Beck system because we're focusing on understory plants and using those to deduce information about the soil moisture regime and the soil nutrient regime. In the Beck system, we also actually take specific measurements of the soil to figure that out. But it's fundamentally the same. We're using plants and soil to figure out the characteristics of that site, and then that should tell us about potential trees that might be able to grow there, potential successional pathways, potential management objectives, or specific management considerations we might need to think about. All right, thank you.